My first question is, okay, in presentations, where a salesman wants to persuade, or even someone making a pitch for an idea, they may use the principles in a certain order. They might start with reciprocity and obligation, and go to commitment and consistency, and then social proof, etc. In what order would you recommend the principles be used in sales presentations, arguments, pitches, etc.?
Okay, well, first of all, that's a great question, and the answer is not so simple. I mean, the good thing and the bad thing about a lot of the sort of psychological work on persuasion and, frankly, many other topics is it depends, right? It depends on the situation, it depends on the content, it depends on the context. But the other thing that I should mention is that, especially with regard to the principles, there really isn't a lot of good research that talks about the sort of how to combine these principles. The truth is that the principles of influence have mostly been examined in isolation. There are a few studies that show that there can certainly be additive effects of using multiple principles at a time, but there's no research that I'm aware of that actually would prescribe the order in which to use the principles. What I would say is this: I'm going to, so the short answer to your question is there's no answer, and I'll stick to the research here rather than speculation. But I'm going to try to give you some answer to your question, and if this overlaps with what Bob Cialdini told you, you can stop me if you've already heard this before. Let me try to answer your question in a slightly different way. So okay. I can't tell you should start off your presentation with reciprocity, and then you should go to social proof, and then there just isn't good research in that. And again, stop me if you've heard this before. But what I can say is that when you're presenting something to an audience, there are a couple of things that I think are critically important in terms of the order. And so here's what I would say, a couple of things. The first thing is that from the standpoint of authority, right, which you and I were just talking about, it is incredibly important to get that authority or authority cues or authority information up front, right? If it turns out that you really are an expert in whatever it is that you're presenting, you don't want that information to come in too late into the presentation. And the reason is that you prefer to have the information that you are talking about filtered through that perception of expertise. Now the question is, how do you actually get across this expertise? Because, before a presentation, I could stand up to a group of strangers, or if I'm trying to, win some business and I'm dealing with people who don't know me very well, I could stand up there and say, hey, by the way, before I begin, let me tell you about how great I am. So I've achieved X, Y, and Z. Well, you certainly could do that, and as long as it's factual, I've achieved this award, or I've been in business for 15 or 20 years or whatever, to the extent that that's true, I think people will believe it. But the problem that comes with that is that people, of course, think that you're boastful or arrogant. And so even though you could increase your perceived expertise, people will just like you less. So there are a number of possibilities. And let me, again, stop me if you talk to Bob Cialdini about this, and I'll move on to something else.
Well, actually, the information you're giving me right now is new information. He basically said that it's circumstantial, and he said you could start with scarcity, you could start with this, you could start with that. He basically said you could start with any of the principles. It just depends on circumstance.
This is new stuff. This is just my perspective on it. So, and he's right. You can, and that's why I'm sort of shifting the answer a little bit. So just getting back to it. So from the authority principle, right? I mean, it stands to reason that I would argue that would be one of the more important ones to get in up front, right? Because all the information that you give during the presentation is going to be filtered through that. So the question is how to deal with this problem of perceived, boastfulness or arrogance. And there are a number of things that you could do that are very simple. So, for example, Bob Cialdini and Geffen Pfeffer, who's at Stanford, and a few other researchers have a nice study where they showed that the influence of an agent is actually very powerful. So in other words, having somebody, so I'll just give you a quick example, then I'll bring this back to the presentation standpoint. And so, they show in their paper, if you think about, a book author trying to sell a book, well, they're going to be paying an agent to say all sorts of good things about them, to the potential publishers. And what Cialdini and Pfeffer and these other researchers find is that even though everybody acknowledges that, you would pay an agent to say good things about you, people don't discount that enough. So whatever the agent is saying about you, people believe it because it's not coming from the author, him or herself, it's coming from somebody else. So does that make sense? And tell me if anything I'm saying is unclear. So there's something about having information being sent by a third party, right, where people don't discount that information even though they should. So let's just bring this back to the presentation context for a second. If let's say that I am in a business meeting, we're trying to win some new business for my company, and I'm going to be the one presenting. If my boss comes with me, or even a colleague comes with me, I would say that rather than me standing up there and talking about how great I am in my previous experience and I've won these awards, it would be actually better for me to have my colleague do the introduction and say, hey, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Noah Goldstein. Here's why he's so great. And just sort of referring back to this study done by Cialdini, Pfeffer, and the others, you would think that that the people in the audience would say, well, yeah, he's saying this about, Goldstein, but, he's biased to say that because they want the business, right? They want our company to give them the business. But it turns out that they don't discount that bias enough. And so they're inclined to not only believe what my colleague is saying about my expertise, but also not blame me for being boastful or arrogant. Now, you can take that one step further and say that it's even better if you could have someone at the company that you're pitching to do let's say the liaison, maybe do the introduction. And if they can actually say these good things about you, then you're in even better shape, right? And one, in my MBA class, I say, it's very, people often, if you give them the responsibility for introducing you, usually there will be very unimpressive, lame introductions, right? Because they don't want to go through the effort of having to, look at your bio. They might say, okay, well, here's Noah Goldstein from X and X company. Here you go, Noah, take it away, right? And maybe they read the title on the, on the screen. But I would advocate is as long as you feel comfortable with this liaison, from the company that you're pitching to or the group you're pitching to give them a little short bio and ask them to take a look at it and maybe even read it. And so that will, at that point you're having someone from their own in-group talk about your expertise. And that's probably the best of all possibilities. The final thing I'll just say on this is that, and forgive me for going into a monologue here, this is just the kind of stuff I talk about in my class. So the other thing you can do is, let's say that you're there alone, right? You don't have a liaison who's going to do the bio for you. You don't have your colleague who's going to do the expertise pitch for you. Another option of kind of getting that information